Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hormone Genius podcast. I'm here with Jamie, and we're doing a little special thing for this podcast episode. So it's just Jamie and I hanging out, and we're going to do a ask the question, and Jamie and Teresa will answer it. Yes. So we're trying to collect your questions and then do a little episode here where we've collected them, and we're going to try to run through them and answer them to the best of our ability.
Amen. We did a little request on our social media. If you're not following our social media, one huge advantage of following us on social media would be to ask your questions. And so Teresa and I are going to do our best to collect those questions and every so often do like a FAQ on fertility matters or hormone matters, whatever that, whatever. So we want to make sure that we're addressing those questions. So follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and be sure to look for those prompts. Often we have like a prompt to ask a question. So anyway, Teresa, I'm really excited about this one because, Teresa and I, we always want to make sure we're, really addressing the pain points. We're really actually making an impact to those of you who are listening. So it helps us. We have peace knowing that this episode absolutely will address your questions because we are specifically answering the questions asked of us. So Teresa, let's get started. What kind of question do you want to start with first?
Yeah, I can give us a start. So one of the questions that we got asked was hormones and depression, and just kind of the overall link to how a woman feels probably in our cycle. And when she has depression, what is the impact of the hormones in that process? So I think this is a really good question because at least for me, obviously seeing patients, I have to kind of discern, and I'm always thinking about women's hormones, which I'm sure maybe that perspective is different than with other doctors and providers. But I have to look at that patient. I have to decide, is this depression or is this the woman's hormones, And so there's certain questions that will go through, do you feel good on some days? Do you feel bad on some days? Is there some sort of I feel good half the month and not half the month? And that kind of gives us a general idea of, okay, is this, just clinical depression all the time? Or is this person experiencing a change or a shift in hormones? And, I've told my story about my own PMS, but I feel like, again, PMS and depression, sometimes there is an element of that together. And for me, I did not realize that I would feel mood-wise significantly different as I approached my menstrual phase. And it wasn't until I was cycle charting that I could even make that distinction. So first and foremost, if you're not tracking your cycle, that's always the best place to start to understand your hormones and its connection to our body and our symptoms. And second, then start to look how do I feel on different days? Where am I in my cycle? And then to keep a log of those symptoms so that you can really understand, is my mood changing and how is it changing in relationship to my hormones?
Yeah. So Teresa, you would say that would be one key indicator on if it's true blue depression alone versus a hormone imbalance. So if it's a hormone imbalance that's causing depression sort of feelings, depressive sorts of feelings, that would be noticed based on the time of cycle. And typically it's before your period starts, that PMS time. So that is what women can be looking for if they are wondering. Is that what you would say?
Yeah. And so, when we think about why that occurs, why is there this thing about how we feel and it changing dramatically when we approach our period? It's because you just spent a roller coaster going up progesterone and estrogen, and then you're going to come back down. Well, what's the scariest part of any roller coaster? Not maybe the going up is for some people, but for most of us, it's when you get to the top, it's the coming down part.
Oh, I love that analogy.
So it's that ride that we have coming down the progesterone and estrogen roller coaster that can be uncomfortable. And to some degree, it's normal, but when women experience a significant mood change, then we know, okay, well, your roller coaster ride, it was too steep, or your roller coaster ride was wrong in some way. And that's when, talking to a practitioner and understanding why you feel particularly depressed, the week before your period or the 2 weeks before your period for that matter. I mean, it really can be almost like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, like almost like I feel one way, like half the cycle, and another way, the other half of the cycle. And, depression stinks. Depression makes you feel like you either don't want to eat or you want to eat all the time. It makes you feel like you just want to close yourself off and not do the things that you truly love to do that make you happy. And you don't want to always spend time with friends when you feel depressed. It disrupts your sleep patterns.
Yeah.
So, and again, that could be true clinical depression. So I don't want to disregard that. So if you feel that way many days out of the cycle, and has nothing to do with your roller coaster, you may have clinical depression, and that may need to be sorted out, with a doctor. But we definitely see this correlation between women feeling a mood change. And for some women, that will feel like a depression before, that week to 10 days, even 2 weeks before their period. And when it disrupts your life and you're doing things differently and you're not behaving like your own self, you really need to see a healthcare provider.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, that can be serious. And so please take that seriously. And work with your provider. Look for people who are trained in naprotechnology who can discern the difference between that, because again, it's not necessarily up to you. I mean, you can find a team of people to support you in that way. I do want to say this, kind of an added question to that first initial question, Teresa, is if the woman who asked that question, or whoever asked that question to us, let's say she was in her 40s or 50s. Okay. Can you share with our listeners also maybe what could be going on in regards to those moods as that woman may or may not be approaching menopause?
I mean, as we, of course, our ovaries have a lifespan to some degree in terms of how long they function, which is just unique in the woman's body, right? We have this, you're going to start your periods at 12, 13, and then you're going to stop this big event that occurs every month at 50 on average. But the 10 years before you hit the end of that, I mean, it's got to kind of end its life, and it's a slow kind of process. And because of that, there is more hormone imbalances that occur. And so women in perimenopause, they can struggle with symptoms related to mood and depression, but also just feeling like edgy and anxious, and frankly, like they want to punch someone's face sometimes. Often we'll hear women say, nobody wants to be around me. My family doesn't want to be around me. Like literally, like send me to an island, So it can be a really difficult time for mood in perimenopause. So it's just even a more, it's a more important time even to be aware of our hormones and to know that we can help those women and we can help make that transition much smoother.
So now with our second question, this is one I really like. Okay, so the question is, what is the pain called women experience during ovulation? And is there a correlation between that pain and the time of actual ovulation? So Teresa, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the pain with ovulation, I mean, in the medical world, we call it middle schmerz. So in the medical world, like so many things get these weird names and you're like, why is it called that? Well, I'll tell you, most of it's just because some guy had that name, mostly guys, right? Back in, but maybe some women too. And then they're like, oh, you get to be naming now ovulation pain, or the Grothian follicle. The follicle in ovulation is named after a guy too. I mean, it's just funny. Anyway, middle schmerz is ovulation pain.
Because middle,
yeah, I guess it does. Yeah, but it's kind of funny. Yeah. So what I like to refer to it is like almost like the stigmata, which is kind of, stigmata is another word that basically means like a wound that's healing. And when I describe it to people like ovulation, it kind of makes sense why there's pain around ovulation. You have this follicle that's growing on the ovary, and a follicle is a fluid-filled cyst. And when our bodies signal that cyst to rupture, it's an inflammatory event. Rupturing is not a gentle sound, Rupturing sounds like something painful. Yeah. And of course, for some people, they would never notice it. But for others, this event can cause some discomfort. And I have correlated it to, because I have experienced this on and off throughout my cycles, that the pain generally occurs after the egg is out. So again, I think of it as the egg releases, that cyst has kind of burst, you could say, and it's collapsing and forming a stigmata there to heal and become then the corpus luteum. So that is where that pain usually comes from. It's not like before the egg is out really, or the growing of the follicle. It's literally like after the release. And generally it only lasts for a couple hours up to, maybe even 6, 8, it's not usually a long event. If there's something longer and it's really painful, that means something's not right. But typical middle Schmerz pain is generally, a couple hours of pain.
I was meeting with a gal who was charting, she was breastfeeding, and she had several children I know. And she had called me once and she was like, oh my gosh, Jamie, I have so much pain. Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? And she went and got an ultrasound, and sure enough, she had just ovulated. It was middle Schmerz. And I think it may have caused more pain. And this is what I want to know from you, Teresa, because she hadn't ovulated in a while. She was pregnant, and then she was breastfeeding, and then it was like her first ovulation was just extremely painful. So I don't know, have you found that, Teresa, with patients that it may just be maybe more noticeable with that first ovulation?
Yeah, I think that there is a correlation with that. And we know that after you've had a baby, those first few cycles, like the body's still sometimes figuring it out again. So that would make sense. And anytime there's inflammation otherwise in the body, for example, in this year, 2021, we're still in a COVID pandemic, right? So we have, anecdotally seen that when people have been sick from COVID, it changes the patterns of ovulation and may cause more pain with ovulation or more heavy bleeding with the period. And that's because there's an additional inflammatory event around that ovulation process. So, and there are some people with conditions like endometriosis that have more ovulation pain. And that's because there's an additional inflammatory disease going on at the same time. So again, there's normal middle Schmerz that might just be the natural process of ovulation for some people, not a big deal, wouldn't make you have to take any medicine. You just notice it and you're like, oh, that's what that is. I'm tracking my cycle. And then there's other types of pains that are more severe around ovulation that may tell you that there's another additional inflammation going on. And so something to consider, like, again, it's always good. What else is going on in my life? Have I been sick? Am I taking care of myself? Am I sleeping right? Am I drinking enough water? Right. And so it's good ideas there.
And BTW, by the way, if you're struggling with pain, or like, let's say you do have endometriosis, or you do have, God forbid, COVID, or anything else that's causing inflammation in your body, some natural ways to address that inflammation, and we hear about it all the time, but for very good reason, is turmeric. Mm-hmm. Turmeric. There's different forms. Look it up online. Yeah. Go do your research. But anyway, I know when people listen, Teresa, they love it when we're giving like some
those tips.
Yeah, the tips to help with that. So go find turmeric. It matters in terms of the grade and the kind. If you have questions, please email us. But
no, that's what I've been using lately. And because I am someone who gets ovulation pain. And honestly, I started turmeric probably about 6 months ago, aggressively, just taking it more routinely. Yeah. And I have not had ovulation pain in the last, I would say, 3 or 4 cycles. So I definitely noticed a difference. It doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody in the world, but it certainly is an awesome anti-inflammatory. And there's others, there's, fish oils, and there's other, good antioxidants, but, that's a really good one. So very good.
Yeah. Okay, Teresa, what's another question that we have here up on the docket?
Yeah. So someone asked a question just about the difference between, fibroids and polyps, and kind of know, what the symptoms that would cause. And this is really good because fibroids and polyps are 2 organic problems that can happen in women's cycles, both pretty common, but both kind of have a different presentation, and they're both very different actually in what they are. Mm-hmm. So polyps are what I call them skin tags. I'm always trying to help people kind of like visualize, have a reference for it. So like, when you get older, sometimes you develop these skin things, right? And like the skin tag is like an overgrowth of something on your skin, and it's kind of hanging off your body, and you're like, what is this? Well, a polyp is kind of the same thing, but it's in your uterine lining.
Mhm.
It's just an overgrowth of endometrial tissue, and it formed itself into what we call polypoid tissue. And when you have a polyp, generally the symptoms are mid-cycle bleeding or just random bleeding. So the polyp tends to cause either mid-cycle bleeding or kind of intermenstrual kind of bleeding patterns kind of throughout the cycle, not like premenstrual spotting, not like tail end bleeding, but more intermenstrually interrupted patterns of bleeding, generally not really heavy, and they're not really painful either at all. So it's just like, why am I just kind of bleeding here and there and everywhere?
Yeah.
And, a polyp is a consideration, not that that has to be a polyp, but that would be how it would present. And of course, you can diagnose it by having an ultrasound done, but not even on an ultrasound. Sometimes they could be missed. Sometimes you even have to have an ultrasound that's special called a saline sonogram. But that's what a polyp is. So, and they have to be generally, if they're bigger, removed by a doctor.
And then, so how does that compare then to fibroids?
Yeah, so fibroids are also pretty common, especially the older we get, it's more likely to get fibroids, and they are fibrous balls of tissue. Think of like golf balls or tennis balls, and they're just kind of these, balls of tissue, and they are fibrous in nature. They're very dense. They're very benign. They don't cause cancer or anything like that, but they definitely influence the size of the uterus and then how the uterus kind of behaves with menstruation. The most common cause or signs that you might have fibroids is heavy bleeding. And this is more common again after the age of 35 and 40 for these to be present, but heavy bleeding with the menstrual cycle and maybe longer menstrual cycle. So instead of like your 5 to 6 day period, now you're like 7, 8, 9, 10. And some of those days are like particularly floody. And maybe clotty. And so that may tell you, I should have a pelvic ultrasound, which would easily identify these fibroids that can grow small, or they can grow very large, actually. And, some women can grow them as large as 8, 9 centimeters. That could be the size of a cantaloupe. So, if you have really heavy periods and you're feeling like something is not right, of course, see a doctor.
So can fibroids, can they resolve themselves?
No, not generally. That I see. But I would say that women who are more estrogen dominant are likely to develop fibroids. And it's probably related to toxins in the environment and endocrine system disruptors, and poor diets and things like that too. You may be more likely. And they also be more likely if they run in your family as well. So there is a genetic component too. The question asked, is there any way to naturally prevent them? There's not a lot of research on exactly how you would. But of course, if you can prevent estrogen dominance, you can keep toxins out of your life. You can eat a really balanced diet without putting a bunch of processed foods, especially like there may be a link between like sucralose and developing these things. I think I've read something about that, and those are like artificial sweeteners. So, just trying to keep all that stuff out of your diet and eat as clean as possible. And, that's about as good as you can do. And sometimes there's just nothing you can do, but they are things that can be treated. And frankly, you don't even have to treat them if they're small, so a lot of people can have them. They will kind of shrink in menopause. Menopause definitely will make them shrink because at menopause, your hormones all go down. And so after that point, then, they're not a concern at all.
Right. Okay. Well, that's actually a perfect leeway into this next question I have, Teresa. The power of natural nutrition to help with progesterone issues, which I love this one. And I think a theme that I'm picking up on more as I read and as we're even communicating about this is inflammation. And so, when we think about painful periods, even like with PMS, the cycle prior, an anti-inflammatory diet, this isn't necessarily about progesterone. And I want you to talk about more on that, Teresa. But I always share with women, if they're struggling with pain, I always say before their period is set to begin, really focus on your diet. I mean, we should be focusing on our diet the whole cycle long, but really that cycle, a week-ish before your period, cut out the red meat, the gluten, the sugars, the things that cause inflammation in the body. I want to say that first and foremost, because I was thinking of it when we were thinking about and talking about inflammation. But Teresa, what would you say in terms of helping to naturally balance that progesterone? What kind of nutrition would you recommend?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And, it's not like there's some foods you can eat, like wild like yams, and that just, if you just eat wild yams, you're going to have better progesterone. I mean, that's not, we haven't really found that to be, but we know that, like, if you're getting the key nutrients that your body needs, because there's so many key nutrients that from a hormone perspective are necessary for our bodies to work correctly. And here's the deal. I mean, an anti-inflammatory, hands down, like, again, it just is the basics: no sugar, getting processed foods out, and trying to focus on really good vegetables, leafy greens, and healthy fats. Like, those are like the basics. Yes, you need to do that. But also remember, we are in like a time where like our soils are so depleted. And I was just, reading about this the other day, and like, you would take an orange that my grandfather would have eaten in California, 60 years ago, 80 years ago. One orange back then, you'd have to eat 10 today to get the amount of vitamin C from that orange a long time ago. And it don't matter if it is organic. It doesn't matter, because it organic or not, organic just means that it's clean, not free of pesticides, but it doesn't mean it came from necessarily a soil that's any different than the soil that the chemically treated vegetables are. So we have to remember that, like, you just have to eat so much more of these beautiful foods to sometimes get the nutrients we need. Hence, I mean, yes, the supplement world can get crazy, and we have to be careful about that. But the fact is that there are a lot of things that we just can't get in our diets anymore, and we kind of have to sometimes replace them. And when I say that, I mean like vitamin D, magnesium, and the B vitamins, but that we could go on, and we're probably going to do an episode specifically about this. But and again, you can get tested, you can find out if you're low in these things, but in general, we kind of do need to support a little bit better some of these nutrients. And that's the best thing you can do. Where does progesterone come from? It comes from a little cyst called a corpus luteum, so it's just that cyst producing it. But so what are we doing to influence progesterone? We're influencing the whole body to support that little cyst to do a better job,
Amen, girl. And like what you were saying about, eating one orange like years ago, and then now eating 10 oranges to make up for it. I'm just going to say this too, is I get this question a lot with supplements. Like, so if you're eating if you are taking supplements, like, how do you know if it's a good supplement? That's a good question, because people are like, if you take the supplements and they're crappy, then you just like poop it out or pee it out and you get rid of it. You're not actually absorbing it. So that's something too you want to think about. Wherever you're getting your supplements from, I would urge you to think twice before getting them over the counter at Walmart, or over the counter at Target or whatever else, because the FDA does not regulate supplements. Literally, people can sell you garbage. They just can. They can sell you garbage. There was this case of this child that died because they bought a supplement that was actually household plants when they thought they were taking some other vitamin, but it was a household plant he ended up being allergic to, because the FDA isn't regulating supplements. So anyway,
right,
you always want to make sure that you're getting good supplements, because unfortunately, like Teresa said, this day and age, it matters. And then even with oils, same. Not all oils are created equal, because the FDA does not regulate essential oils. And so same thing, you could be getting organic oils somewhere, but the soil could be terrible. If the place they're harvesting the lemon from is not like Italy or Florida or some southern state, it's not going to be a good lemon. It's not going to be a good oil. So supplements, oils, all the things this day and age, it's just important to know, to be informed when you're purchasing these things.
Yeah, really, really good point, Jamie.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. All right. So I think we could do one more question, don't you think?
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay, let's see. Do you want to do it, or do you want me to? Let's see.
Yeah, I can do it. If you don't have one, you have one that you like or ready for. I've got one.
Okay, you go for it, girl.
Okay. So a question, and this is from someone else who is a women's health nurse practitioner. So shout out to you for sending this question. Thank you so much. But I'd like to know more on testing and treating abnormal bleeding with progesterone, and when to time lab draws, and then the strength and dosing of administering a progesterone. So, I mean, we can't give obviously complete medical advice about all of these things, but this is a good question about just understanding, when you go to a provider, what should you be expecting in terms of a good evaluation if you've got abnormal bleeding? And how would that look? So of course, we know there's all sorts of different abnormal bleeding patterns in menstrual cycles. And when there are abnormal bleeding patterns, we wonder if there's something hormonally off, you know, but we also need to also think of the physical things like those polyps and those fibroids too. So we can't ignore the fact that it's not all hormonal abnormal bleeding.
Right.
But it's a good idea to think of your hormones, of course, because bleeding patterns are all set up around the beautiful roller coaster of our hormones that cause a regular menstrual flow to be nice and behaved and within that, you know, 7 days. So looking at timing of progesterone, we need to make sure that we know whether there's a main event or not a main event going on, right, Jamie?
Right.
So,
totally.
yeah, I mean, it's all coming down to that. With abnormal bleeding, is the main event there? Number one. And if ovulation is not there, then it makes sense. Okay, well, there's going to be abnormal bleeding because there's no rhythm to the hormones at all. And in that situation, sometimes you cannot time progesterone levels because there is no event to time them around, right? So if it's obvious there's an absence of ovulation, then timing progesterone may be difficult in terms of blood draws. The only time you can really truly time blood draws appropriately with any abnormal bleeding pattern would be if you can identify the main event.
Yep.
And so you have a way to track that. Of course, cycle tracking is the best way, mucus, temperature, LH, killer, all of the ways that we teach you about. But you have to have a way to identify that. And then you need to time it with that event. So like when we do blood draws, I'll do them. Most of the time I do something like what I call a limited luteal profile. It means I'm drawing progesterone levels about 4 or 5 days after ovulation to start. And then I'm doing them every other day for about 3 or 4 draws. You might call that like ovulation plus 5, 7, 9 days, and that's going to give me an idea of what those levels are on the roller coaster ride of that woman's hormones and to see where there's any deficiencies. And I always do estrogen too, because they work, in tandem with each other.
Yeah.
So that's the most common type of timing of testing you would do, an ovulation post, and doing them on like 5, 7, 9. You can do a shorter, you can do a longer, but I kind of like 3 days is always kind of like if I can do it best for everybody, I would love to do that. But if there's no, again, ovulation pattern, sometimes we just need to stop the abnormal bleeding pattern. And so we use different forms of progesterone to do that. And of course, Jamie knows we use all sorts of different forms like vaginal and shots and oral. If the bleeding pattern is crazy, sometimes we have to use shots. If it's not, sometimes I'll use oral. And that's something I can't completely go into detail about, but just know there is a way to address that for every woman.
And if you're listening and you're like, oh, I'm so glad this question is being asked because I think that I have a progesterone issue. I think I do, but... Or maybe you're like, I'm not getting pregnant and I don't know why. And they say my progesterone levels are normal. Well, here's the dealio. This is like I can tell you, one of the number one cases that I get when I meet with couples who are struggling with fertility is it's unexplained. It's called unexplained fertility, but I don't like that phrase because there is an explanation. But I would say the majority of people that come to me, they're unexplained infertility. That's what they're called. So they come and the first question I ask is, have you checked your progesterone level? And they're like, yeah. And I said, well, how many days did you go in to get your labs done? And what day did you go in? They're like, oh, day 21, they checked it once. And I'm like, okay, well, this might be a pretty easy case, potentially, who knows? Because you may have a luteal phase defect because there are like 3 or 4 of them. Teresa, I don't remember. Like, is there 4 or 5?
Yeah, there's 4. I mean, there might even be 5, but in general, there's at least 3 standard ones, and then there's a 4th. Yeah.
So luteal phase defect. Okay, your corpus luteum. Luteal phase is after you ovulate, which is when the corpus luteum exists. The corpus luteum is what was once the follicle. Think about like caterpillar to a butterfly sort of idea. So the corpus luteum produces progesterone. And those levels of progesterone, just like Teresa said, it's like a roller coaster. It's different every single day. So I think you're probably pulling all the pieces together if you're listening and you're like, oh, I'm having a hard time getting pregnant. They checked my progesterone levels once. Well, here's the thing. Does that make sense? It doesn't. It doesn't make sense that you're getting it drawn on day 21 if you are not charting and you don't know when you ovulated. If you are charting and day 21 happens to be a day that you do get a draw, cool, because you know that makes sense based on maybe when you ovulated, if you ovulated day 17 or 18 or something. But if you aren't charting, you don't know when you're ovulating and you're getting your labs done day 21, that number means nothing. It means nothing. And so it is so important to chart your cycle so you know when you ovulate. And then secondly, to get your lab work done on the right day/days. So that's so key for those of you who have quote unquote unexplained infertility. Go find a NAPRO doctor, go find a fertility care practitioner, email us, whatever, because that is one of the easiest-ish cases that we can help address. I get kind of fired up about it.
Yeah, you are getting fired up, girl. I love it.
You guys are watching. Whoa, Jamie's eyes. Her eyes are so big.
Yeah, that's good though. It's so important. I mean, I just had a patient yesterday. I think she had gone to her OBGYN because she's having infertility, and she's like, she gave me all the levels, and she drew them on day 3. She drew a progesterone level.
What?
And I'm like, yeah. And again, sometimes you're just like, that you do not make any progesterone at all in your menstrual cycle. Negligible amounts of progesterone unless you have ovulated and you're past that point. And I like to say, if you just generally conceptualize, like about a week after ovulation is the top of that roller coaster. So if you just had to do a basic check, the top of the roller coaster is where you want to kind of just get that basic check. And, that's about 7 days after ovulation. So, again, it's hard because there are a lot of providers who aren't educated about this, and that's can be frustrating. So if you're frustrated with what your doctor is offering you, reach out to us. Maybe we can help you find a provider that understands it a little bit better.
Yep. And the reason day 21 is the lab draw is because people assume that women ovulate on day 14, which then 21 would be a week after. But the key is if your physician's saying that, oh, you ovulate day 14, which is why we're doing day 21, but you actually aren't charting and there's no proof of ovulation at day 14, that's like your key flag of, oh, actually, maybe I need a second opinion here. Or at least start charting and inform your doctor, because they literally might not know and they probably really do care. And so again, educate them, share this podcast episode with them, whatever the case is, because again, most physicians do care. They just were never taught in med school.
Absolutely.
So cool, Teresa. Well, this was a fun episode, don't you think?
Yes, really fun episode. And frankly, we just don't have time to get to all the questions that we even have gotten asked at this point. So just know we are going to keep a file with those questions and get to yours in a future live FAQ on our podcast. So, and please keep sending your questions, keep sending your comments. Please subscribe to our podcast so that you get the notification every time that a new episode comes out. Because frankly, they come out quite often. We want to make sure you know when the new episodes come out. So please subscribe to our podcast on whatever podcasting listening forum you have. And, share it with your friends and your loved ones. Our goal, again, is to reach out to you with the information that you really desire and want to hear. So, keep talking to us.
All right. Thank you so much, Teresa, for today. Thank you for our listeners. Stay tuned. Check out our website. We have very exciting ways to support us. So check out our website to learn more about that too.